everyone, thanks for joining me today. My name is Nelson Cummins. I work for the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. We're an anti-racist charity based here in Glasgow. And today I wanted to speak to you about Glasgow and Black resistance as part of the Association for the Study of African American Life and Histories Black History Month programme for February in 2023. So before I get into the topic of the talk, I wanted to just introduce you to CRER and our work. So we're the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. We're an anti-racist organisation based in Scotland, specifically based in the city of Glasgow. A lot of our work focuses on social, economic and political equality and campaigning and aiming to achieve that for Black and minority ethnic people living in Scotland. And a lot of our work centres around research work, policy work, capacity building, and a lot of it is also based around evidence-based policy and a rights-based approach to our work. And it's also important to highlight, I think, in any discussion around race equality, the reality of race equality in Scotland and in Glasgow. So we know in Scotland that people from a Black or minority ethnic background are disproportionately impacted by inequalities that you might associate with systemic and structural racism. So that includes barriers faced in terms of education, barriers faced in terms of employment, barriers to equal access to healthcare, and also being disproportionately impacted by things like such as hate crime and sort of violent, racist, racially motivated attacks as well. So I also wanted to talk to you a bit about our work around Black History Month in Scotland. I think that will give you a bit of context as to why we're involved in this talk with the Association for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History today. So Black History Month in Scotland has been coordinated since 2001 by us, starting back when we were the Glasgow Anti-Racist Alliance. In our approach to Black History Month, we take inspiration from the origins of Black History Month in the UK. So that is an approach to having Black History Month take place in October every year. And it's also an approach that revolves around Black History Month being rooted in the solidarity of the anti-racist movement. And in 2022, our Black History Month programme had over 110 events from over 40 different community partners and organizations, highlighting that it really is a collaborative program that we put together. We're relying on lots of support from individuals and organizations from across Scotland and from across a range of sectors and backgrounds. The program included walking tours, talks, film screenings, art displays, and many other events. And you can also find our recordings, archives, and old programs and things like that on the Black History Month Scotland website, the link to which is there. But also, if you just put Black History Month Scotland into Google, you can find it that way. And you may see as well that phrase at the bottom, Black History is Scotland's history. And that phrase really embodies to us why we do this work. Black History Month for us is a chance and a time to ask really key questions as to why Black history is not recognised as being, part of wider history, and also a time for us to really emphasise that you can't have the sort of true and full picture of history in Scotland without looking at how it interchanges and connects with Black history. Black history is a really key part of Scotland's history. The experiences of Black and minority ethnic people in Scotland and their relationships to Scotland as a nation is really essential for understanding and having the sort of true and full picture of Scottish history. I don't think you can tell a story of Scottish history without focusing on Black history as a key and essential part of that. So on to the topic of today's talk. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit and give you a bit of introduction to Black resistance in Glasgow. But before I sort of give some examples of that, I wanted to sort of give a bit of context to Glasgow as a city and also why perhaps it has become a central point for thinking about Black resistance. So Glasgow is Scotland's largest city by size and population. It's a city heavily shaped by wealth derived from slavery. And you can see that in lots of different parts of our city. You can see a lot of it in the built heritage of Glasgow, a lot in the history of Glasgow and the economic, social, and cultural development of Glasgow as a city as well. And there's an example of that on the screen, actually. So you may see the street sign Virginia Street. So Virginia Street is a street that sits in the city centre of Glasgow. And it is one of Glasgow's many street names that is influenced by Glasgow's connections to slavery. So lots of Glaswegian enslavers from families such as the Buchanans, the Oswalds, owned plantations in Virginia during the era of transatlantic slavery. They made lots of wealth from these plantations, particularly from the trade of tobacco grown by enslaved labour. And this wealth came back to the city of Glasgow and played a really key role in the economic and social development of the city of Glasgow. And Glasgow's history is really tied to wealth derived from slavery, and understanding the extent to that is really key for understanding the development and growth of Glasgow as a city today. But there is an attitude that quite often runs through our city. You'll have it up there called saying it wasn't us. And that phrase, I think, really captures the attitude that's held by quite a lot of Glaswegians, not all, but quite a few people in Glasgow, to Glasgow's connections to slavery. And that is to see it as something that didn't happen in Glasgow, something that happened thousands of miles away, and something that Glasgow wasn't connected to, when the reality is actually much different. And as I've just highlighted, Glasgow is heavily shaped by wealth derived from slavery. And Glasgow as a city as well has been heavily impacted and shaped by Black resistance in the past and in the present day. And it's also Scotland's most diverse city in the present day. So we know off the back of the 2021 pupil census in Scotland that approximately 1 in 4 school pupils in Glasgow are from a Black or minority ethnic background. And that shows us that Glasgow is not only Scotland's most diverse city, but it's also a city in which the Black population is growing. And it's a city that is continuing to become more and more diverse. And that, I think that means it's also a city where Black resistance to racism, even though there's already significant Black resistance to racism in Glasgow, it's also a city where that Black resistance to racism is only going to grow and grow. So to start thinking about that Black resistance in Glasgow, I thought a perfect sort of figure and person to speak about this issue through was Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass, the sort of iconic African-American abolitionist, really key figure in understanding any form of sort of civil rights, history of Black resistance, is someone who's had incredibly significant influence across the globe. But he's also someone who had a significant influence and impact on the city of Glasgow itself. So in 1846, Frederick Douglass spoke in the city. You can actually see the venue of the city halls where he gave his first lecture in the city on the screen there. And that's an image of the halls in the present day. It sits in Glasgow city centre, just off Ingram Street in the Merchant City part of the city. And he spoke here in 1846 to an audience of 1,500 people. And although he spoke about, like he did in many of his public speeches, his experience of escaping enslavement, his campaigns against abolition in America, and that was a particular focus of his talks, he also actually led campaigning action in Scotland and in Glasgow against the Free Church of Scotland. So the Free Church of Scotland were still exist today, a significant organisation in the 1800s, a significant church in the 1800s that had sort of thousands of members. And they were an organisation and a church that took money from plantation owners in the American Deep South. And that made them a particular target for Frederick Douglass, as you might imagine. When in Scotland, he led a popular campaign which had the phrase "send the money back," which was quite simply a call for people of Scotland to campaign against the Free Church and for the Free Church of Scotland to send the money back and the donations back that it had taken from enslavers based in America. But what is quite interesting around this is, even though that campaign was significant and got support from across Scotland from thousands of people, the Free Church of Scotland itself actually had a sort of history of taking donations from those who benefited from slavery. So dating back to the era of slavery in the UK, right up until the abolition of slavery in the UK in 1833, the Free Church of Scotland had taken donations from enslavers, and we partly know this through the work of Stephen Mullen in his recently published book, The Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy, that highlights some of the huge donations that the Free Church of Scotland took from enslavers and Scottish enslavers. So even though Frederick Douglass's campaign was incredibly significant one and gained lots of support, I think it's also important to highlight that this practice of donations sort of flowing from enslavers to institutions and key organisations in Scotland was a long established process, and it was something that was engaged in by Scottish enslavers, and it wasn't just a case of American enslavers donating to these institutions as well. But Frederick Douglass's campaign and his speeches were incredibly significant in continuing to highlight this and highlighting the continual donations that these organisations took from enslavers after slavery had been abolished in the UK in 1833. So moving on, I also wanted to highlight and show you a little insight into where Frederick Douglass stayed in the city of Glasgow. So you may notice the middle image of the three, that is 161 Gallowgate in the present day. And that was the former home of William Smeal, who was the person who invited Frederick Douglass to Scotland and gave him a place to stay when he was in Scotland. Admittedly, his home probably didn't look like that in the 1800s with a coffee and cream shop below it. But you can also see on the map whereabouts in the city it was located. So relatively central in the sort of east end of Glasgow city centre. And this home served as Frederick Douglass's base in Scotland. So not only was it his sort of base when he gave speeches in Glasgow and places in the west of Scotland, he also used it as a base to have sort of copies of his autobiography delivered to, that he would sell at his lectures, and used it as a base that he could go back to in between his trips all over Scotland and even his trips to Ireland. So in Scotland, Frederick Douglass sort of went up the East Coast and went to Edinburgh, Aberdeen, sort of all over, giving sort of sold out, packed out lectures where he would also sell his autobiography, raising funds from these talks and from these tours to establish his abolitionist newspaper, to support the Underground Railroad, and to support the general abolitionist struggle. And I think these donations by Scottish people, whether it's by sort of paying for his autobiography or donations taken after his public lectures, are a clear example of how people across Scotland and people in Glasgow supported Black resistance and supported the Black resistance of the abolitionist movement in America. But it also serves as a bit of a legacy of how these people supported Black resistance in the UK and in the UK, and specifically in the campaign for the abolition of slavery in 1833, a campaign that gained significant support in Glasgow and in Edinburgh and across Scotland as well. So moving on, I also wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the other Black abolitionists who visited Scotland as well, because even though the talks and impact and the influence that Frederick Douglass had on Glasgow is incredibly significant, I think it's important to highlight that he is part of a wider history of Black resistance in Scotland and in Glasgow, and he's also part of a wider history of Black abolitionists campaigning and speaking in Glasgow. So this includes the Reverend Josiah Henson, William Wells Brown, Moses Roper, Ida B. Wells, who all spoke in Glasgow between 1846 and 1893. Hannah Murray has produced an excellent website called Frederick Douglass in Britain that highlights some of the 60 lectures that were given by several abolitionists and activists across Scotland. And there's also a really handy map on that site that shows you where these lectures took place. And it's a really useful resource for looking at the history of Black abolitionists in Scotland and in Glasgow. And it's also important to state that even though there were these visits from African-American abolitionists and campaigners to Glasgow and to Scotland, there was also Black resistance engaged in by people living in Scotland, by Black people living in Scotland. And this includes, amongst many people, Joseph Knight, a man who fought for his own freedom from slavery, who escaped slavery to become a freed man in the west of Scotland. But there are also many other examples of people running away from enslavement within Scotland. And you can find out more of this as a sort of Glasgow runaway slavery database that highlights some of these cases. I think it's important to highlight this as well, because even though Frederick Douglass's visit to Glasgow is a really central point and really significant in highlighting Black resistance in Scottish history, it's not the first example of Black resistance in Scottish history. There's plenty of Black resistance engaged in by Black people living in Scotland and campaigning against slavery as well. And I should also highlight on this note as well that Glasgow and Glasgow University is the site of where James McCune Smith studied in Scotland. So James McCune Smith, the first African-American man to get a doctor's degree, studied at the University of Glasgow and graduated from the University of Glasgow in 1837. And we know that he was engaged in acts of Black resistance in Glasgow too, not only through his sort of achievement of succeeding and gaining a medical degree in a very white institution such as the University of Glasgow, but also in the fact that he was involved in the abolitionist anti-slavery societies during his time in Glasgow as well. And some of the images you can see on the screen there as well. So the image on the left, that's an image of George Square in 1800s Glasgow, just to give you an idea of what some of the streets of Glasgow may have looked like for people like Frederick Douglass, people like Ida B. Wells when they visited our city, and give you an idea of what the city looked like in that era. And here is, on the right, is an image of this part of the city in the modern day. So this is the Gallery of Modern Art, a museum and art gallery that sits right in the heart of Glasgow city centre, and is a museum that has lots of connections to legacies of slavery and empire. So during the time in which Frederick Douglass would have been in Glasgow, this would have been the Royal Exchange Square, a place where goods were traded, and many of these goods came from Britain's sort of colonial interests, so Britain's role of empire, and were taken from colonies such as India and also colonies in the Caribbean and things like that. And also the building itself actually has connections to slavery in its foundation. So when the building was first built, it was the mansion of William Cunningham, an enslaver who made lots of money from slavery, who lived here, and parts of the building today are still were parts of his mansion when it was originally built. And in the present day, it is part of Glasgow Museums as a modern art gallery, and an art gallery, and sort of parts of the museum and parts of the museum's collection still have connections to those legacies of slavery and empire as well. So moving on, I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about Black resistance in Glasgow and how it sort of has continued since the visit of Frederick Douglass to the city. So there have been lots of different examples of sort of further Black resistance in Glasgow. So this includes the life story of Andrew Watson, He was the first black footballer to play for Scotland, quite a significant act of black resistance in sort of succeeding and becoming a very successful footballer in the late 1800s, at a time when the game was largely dominated by white players. And Andrew Watson also founded and funded the football club Park Grove, which no longer exists anymore, but is a significant example of a sort of black-owned and black-led football club that had many black players play for them, but also had players of different heritage play for them as well. So they also had players of Asian heritage play for the club. And it's one of the first examples, I think, of a real sort of multicultural football club, something that can then only really be seen as existing again from the sort of modern era of the game, from the sort of 1990s onwards, particularly in the city of Glasgow. So I think that's an important example to highlight. And there's also other examples of black resistance that have impacted Glasgow and impacted Scotland in many significant ways. I think it's important to highlight the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, and that is what is being sort of given a nod to in the images on the slide. They gained significant support across Scotland, and particularly in Glasgow, where there was a very large sort of march and protest taking part in hundreds at a time of sort of lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of the demands made from that protest really speak to the sort of heart of black resistance in terms of really looking for significant reforms to change and really create a more equal and more racially equal world. So that includes, like demands for educational reform, demands for reform in terms of treatment in healthcare and things like that. And it's also really important, I think, to highlight that there have been significant examples of black resistance and civil rights movements across Scotland as well. So a notable example of that is the Lothian Black Forum, who were a black-led group who existed in Edinburgh in the 1990s, who led one of Scotland's sort of first marches for race equality, and that was calling for justice after the murder of Ahmed Abuka Sheikh, who was killed in a racially motivated murder in Edinburgh in the 1990s. And I should also highlight as well, there's an ongoing campaign for justice for Sheikh Bayou, who was a black man who died in police custody in Fife in 2015. And I think a lot of the sort of movement and calls and campaigns for justice and answers around the circumstances surrounding his death really speak to the sort of core of black resistance, and a really significant example of black resistance in Scotland as well. And sort of in terms of concluding remarks, I think it's just important to state that even though I sort of picked the example of Frederick Douglass as a significant example of black resistance in Glasgow and black resistance in Scotland, I think it's important to highlight that visit by Douglass really happens in a sort of wider history of black resistance in Glasgow and Scotland. And even though it's incredibly significant, there has been lots of black resistance engaged in, like it's engaged in anywhere, engaged in Glasgow and Scotland, because I think wherever there are black people, there's black resistance, and black resistance in particular to racism. And Glasgow and Scotland are no different in having that history of black resistance and civil rights activism and activism to aim to achieve racial equality and to fight against institutional racism and white supremacy. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining me. You can find sort of further information about all our work on our social media handles that are all up on the screen there. You can find out more information on our CRER website and our Black History of Scotland website. And also, if any questions come up at all from the talk, my email is just on the screen there. So really, please feel free to get in touch. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the talk. And if you have any further questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. And also thank you to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History for yet again asking us to be involved in Black History Month in the US. It's a real honor to be asked to be involved and involved in a fantastic international committee of very talented people. So it really means a lot. So yeah, thank you everyone again. You can see some of the sources that we've used today to put together this talk. Yeah, all worth a look at if you want to do any further reading on any of the content I've covered. But yeah, just to finish up, I think it's really important to remember that Black resistance, as much as it's a key part of history and a key part of movements against inequality and racism and structural institutional racism. I know things that come to mind out of that, particularly things like transatlantic slavery and civil rights movements, both in the US and in Scotland and the UK. I think it's just important to highlight that Black resistance is something that hasn't stopped. It's something that's still going on. It's something that's being done in Scotland and in Glasgow to protest against the continued existence of institutional racism here. But thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for joining me today.